Welcome to episode 8 of CN Live. I'm Elizabeth Voss.
And I'm Joe Loria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News.
On tonight's program, we examine 3 political crises around the world: the drama unfolding in Westminster over Brexit, the collapse of Italy's coalition government and the institution of a new cabinet, and India's attempt to annex Kashmir. But first, the headlines. Jeremy Hammond, an imprisoned activist who leaked the Stratford files to WikiLeaks, has been brought from his Memphis, Tennessee prison to Alexandria, Virginia, to testify before a federal grand jury in what is believed to be an attempt to bring additional charges against imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. Chelsea Manning, the whistleblower who leaked secret documents on the Afghan and Iraq wars, is imprisoned in Alexandria for refusing to testify before that same grand jury. Hammond is now being held in the same prison facility as Manning. The Jeremy Hammond Support Committee said in a statement, quote, "The government's effort to try to compel Jeremy to testify is punitive and mean-spirited. Jeremy has spent nearly 10 years in prison because of his commitment to his firmly held beliefs. There is no way that he would ever testify before a grand jury. The government knew this when they gave him immunity in every federal jurisdiction except in exchange for his guilty plea." We'll be joined after the headlines by radio host Peter B. Collins to discuss the Hammond case.
It is now more than a month since Kashmir has been on lockdown after India revoked Article 370 of its constitution that gave the province special autonomy. As India attempts to annex the disputed territory, hundreds of Kashmiri males have been arrested, telephone and internet communications have been cut, and curfews are in place. Human Rights Watch reports Kashmir has been at the heart of a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan since the two nations gained their independence in 1947. Both claimed Kashmir. In 1948, the then ruler of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, Maharaja Hari Singh, who was holding out for independence, accepted becoming part of India on condition that the state retain autonomy in all matters except defense, currency, and foreign affairs. UN resolutions calling for a plebiscite to determine the final status of the territory have been rejected by India, which claims that because Kashmiris have voted in national elections in India, there's no need for a plebiscite. Pakistan maintains that a plebiscite should be held. Several of the militant groups in Kashmir have also called for a plebiscite, but argue that an independent Kashmir should be an option. And now India has revoked that autonomy and claimed Kashmir to be part of India. Joining us later in the program today will be Maleeha Lodhi, Pakistan's ambassador to the United Nations.
In a dramatic series of moves at Westminster this week, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was twice defeated on bills to prevent a no-deal Brexit and to hold a general election on October 15. We'll be joined later by Scottish journalist John Wight from Edinburgh to break down the complicated parliamentary manoeuvres and to discuss the role of the United States and Donald Trump in all of this.
Italian politics are usually presented as Byzantine and chaotic by the US press and somehow unrelated to the rest of Western democracies. But the political drama playing out in Rome over the past few weeks is very much tied to the rest of Europe and even to the United States. Journalists Attilio, Moro, and Andrew Spannaus will be joining us later from Milan to unravel it for us. And finally, Consortium News is back up again after 5 days in which we were unable to publish new material. In July, we were hacked, according to our web hosts. We are not certain what the cause was this time, but we're happy to resume providing news and analysis to our readers. We are now joined by radio host Peter B. Collins, standing by in the Bay Area to discuss the Jeremy Hammond's case. Peter, welcome to CN Live.
Thank you, Joe and Elizabeth. It's great to be with you, and I am delighted to see that consortiumnews.com is once again online.
As we all are, Peter. Tell us what you make of the Jeremy Hammond's case. Why have they brought him here to Alexandria, Virginia, where I am, to testify to the same grand jury as Chelsea Manning? He's being held in the same facility as Chelsea Manning now. What possible additional charges could they be bringing against Assange, or are they going after other members of WikiLeaks around him? Is that what this is about, you think?
I don't claim to know. There is some interesting speculation, but the move was kind of murkily executed by the government. In fact, I've heard 2 different reports about where Hammond was being held, one in Michigan, the other in Memphis, Tennessee. In any event, he has been transferred to Alexandria. And I want to credit Kevin Gostola at Shadowproof, who, of course, did great coverage of the Manning trial at Fort Meade years ago and has really been on top of a lot of these hacker stories. And we need to go back and look at the origins of the Hammond case, because he was a well-known hacktivist, but he was drawn in to the hacking of Stratfor by a paid government informant named Hector Javier Monsegur. And as we look at the plea deal that Hammond took, he was very principled and did not implicate any other people in the activity, including the paid informant. So when you look at the profile of Jeremy Hammond, it seems highly unlikely that he would testify before this grand jury. And he, through his lawyers, has issued pretty strong statements saying that he has no inclination to do so. Also, you have to look at the government's tactics here, because Hammond is close to the end of his sentence. He is in the final stages of a drug rehabilitation program, and his transfer will cost him good time. So that simply because of this move, irrespective of what happens next, he may end up serving more time in federal prison because of this arbitrary move by the government. Then we look at, okay, what could Hammond give them that they don't already know? And that is a head scratcher as well, because he did transfer Stratfor information to WikiLeaks. And perhaps this is part of the government effort to paint Assange as a participant in the collection of stolen material and move beyond claims of journalism and protected activity as a publisher to try to paint him as either a thief or a conspirator to the theft of materials. But all of this, comes up against a couple of brick walls. Hammond has shown himself to be quite principled, and it's hard to imagine that he is going to cave at the threat of further jail time. And it appears that while the judge in Alexandria could try to impose fines for contempt, the way he has with Chelsea Manning, imprisoning Jeremy Hammond is not much of a punishment. It appears that the judge could essentially pause the Stratfor sentence to impose the contempt sentence. And then when the contempt is resolved, Hammond would continue to serve the remainder of his prior sentence, the Stratfor sentence.
That looks like, Peter, that looks like what he would do. Maybe the food is worse in the Alexandria facility. That could be the punishment, but I bet you they would just add it on. I want to bring Elizabeth in here. I did read Kevin's story, by the way, and he seems to, it was a good story, and he seems to suggest that the grand jury, the government is going after other associates of WikiLeaks and not to add additional charges to Assange, because, of course, under the treaty between the US and the UK, the US would have already had to tell everything they were going to charge Assange with before Britain can make an extradition decision, and that there was a deadline in June, I believe, June 18th, if I recall. However, there is this loophole, the so-called rule of specialty, that the US could quietly ask Britain to waive, and then they could add more charges. But I tend to think Kevin may be right that they're going after associates. I see Elizabeth shaking her head. So do you agree with it?
No, I do. I'm nodding my head because I completely agree. I think
nodding your head.
Yeah, I think that in a practical sense, they're already going after Assange for 175 years worth of charges. I think that it would not be practical to try to add on more years to that tally. But I think that what this does is it sets an example. I think it's an expression of visceral hatred on the part of the intelligence establishment and the Washington Beltway establishment against WikiLeaks and his, as you say, associates. And I think that it strikes one as an inquisition. It strikes someone as simply going after people close to Assange and close to WikiLeaks, again, to make an example of them. So I completely agree with Kevin's take on that.
I'd like to remind us and our viewers that at the end of July, a judge in the Southern District of New York, John Keltel, issued a stunning ruling that apparently has not trickled down to the district there in Northern Virginia, because he very clearly dismissed the Democratic National Committee's lawsuit, which was alleging this conspiracy between the GRU and WikiLeaks. And he basically has dismissed the case with prejudice, which means that it can't be refiled except under extraordinary circumstances. And let me quote from part of his decision. If WikiLeaks could be held liable for publishing documents concerning the DNC's political, financial, and voter engagement strategies, simply because the DNC labels them secret and trade secrets, then so could any newspaper or other media outlet. But that would impermissibly elevate a purely private privacy interest to override the First Amendment interest in the publication of matters of the highest public concern. And he went on to say that the DNC's arguments are threadbare. At no point does the DNC allege any facts showing that Assange or WikiLeaks participated in the theft of the DNC's information. Now, I recognize that the case against, that the grand jury is examining and the charges brought against Assange so far don't relate to 2016 and the allegations related to the Russian meddling in the 2016 campaign. But it is widely presumed that that's what the prosecutors would do if they do reopen the filing with the British and essentially start the clock over on the extradition proceedings. So I guess that Hammond, while his case seems fatally tainted to me because of its origins with a paid FBI informant who set him up, it seems the government is struggling to avoid the ruling of the New York court and proceed with an angle on WikiLeaks and Assange related to theft as a way of getting beyond the objections of, the occasional objections of the corporate media in its editorial voices.
Thank you very much for joining us for this segment. We're going to keep an eye on the Jeremy Hammond case. Both of them are here now, 8-minute drive away from me. It's both Chelsea and Jeremy Hammond, and it's just very troubling that the government continues to pursue this, let alone having charged them under the Espionage Act.
And let me just close by saying that we've heard no objections from elected officials. Most human rights groups and justice groups are generally silent about both Manning's continued incarceration for so-called contempt and now these maneuvers with Hammond. And so I'm glad to have the opportunity to raise our voices on behalf of these whistleblowers, and I hope we can spread that a little bit.
Well, thank you, Peter. We are going to present as much news and information about this development as we can. We're moving on to now the issue of Kashmir, a problem that's existed since 1947, but has taken a dramatic turn when last month India decided to revoke Article 370 of its constitution, which granted autonomy to Kashmir. So India is trying to claim it all for itself, basically. We spoke earlier with Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi, the Pakistani envoy to the United Nations. Ambassador Lodhi served twice as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States here in Washington, and once as Pakistan's envoy to the United Kingdom as well. She also served as the first female editor of a major newspaper anywhere in Asia. Ambassador Lodhi joined us earlier from her country's mission to the UN in New York, and we're going to roll the tape now. We're very pleased now to be joined from New York at the mission of Pakistan to the United Nations by Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi. Ambassador Lodhi has been at the UN for several years now. I remember when I was covering the UN that I had several interesting conversations with her. She's a former journalist, so she understands what we're doing here. And we do appreciate you coming on to speak to us about this, a very difficult issue of Kashmir. The U.S. media has done, I think, a pretty poor job covering Kashmir from the very beginning, certainly in the last years. It's not a priority. Certainly they give much more ink to the Palestinian-Israeli issue than they give to Kashmir. So a lot of Americans, who are the majority of our audience, although we're seen around the world, don't have any idea what the Kashmir issue is about. Could you give us a very succinct, if that's possible, in 2 minutes, a history of the Kashmir issue leading up to what has happened in the last few weeks?
Well, I've never had to sum up such a complicated issue in a soundbite, but let me try. The issue of Jammu and Kashmir is the issue of the unfinished agenda of decolonization, because what it involves is a disputed area inhabited by over 14 million Kashmiris, and these people, at the time of independence of both Pakistan and India, people of Kashmir were promised by Indian leaders and by UN Security Council resolutions that were adopted in 1948 and subsequently that they would have the right to guide and determine their political future and their destiny by a plebiscite which had to be freely held. Now, a former Prime Minister of India, Mr. Nehru, had promised them this as well. But these promises were broken. So the story of Kashmir is the story of a monumental tragedy of broken promises, human rights violations, military occupation, or what we see today, a curfew that has lasted for over 32 days, with all of Jammu and Kashmir being turned into an armed cage, where people are not even allowed to come out of their homes.
What is the immediate impact now on the region, and what is the latest that we could learn about?
I think there are two things to keep in mind. One, we have never seen so much international focus, including by the Western media and Western human rights organizations, on the plight of the Kashmiri people, because everyone knows what's happening there. The footage, the news, the reports that are coming out of there show a story of torture, arbitrary arrests, and of course, the freedom of Kashmiris being completely taken away from them. So this is the state of play right now. And this state of play obviously is untenable, because India's action, which it took on the 5th of August, to formally annex Jammu and Kashmir, whereas, as I said to you before, it is disputed territory, it is an international dispute.
So what India did, of course, was to revoke Article 370 from its constitution, which had given autonomy to Kashmir, and is now annexing it, as you say. Some people compare what's happening in Kashmir to what I mentioned earlier, to the Palestinian issue. That in Israel, there have been more and more movements towards annexing at least the settlements, if not all of the West Bank at some point. Is that a fair comparison between the two?
I think it is correct to depict it that way, because the Indian action of 5th of August seems to be right out of the Israeli playbook and the way the Israelis have treated the people of Palestine. Both issues are about an occupied people and occupied territory. Both issues are among the oldest issues on the UN Security Council agenda. Both issues concern the lack of implementation of UN Security Council resolution. And both issues are about the plight of the people who've been dispossessed, who have seen their liberty taken away from them in every possible way. So I think when we talk about the people of occupied Kashmir, we must remember this is about a people who are in deep distress, who have been held prisoners in their own land, who cannot pray, whose children cannot go to school. One teenager died of what are used as guns to put down peaceful demonstrations, which are pellet guns. One teenager lost his life today to pellet gun injuries. So what you're looking at is a situation of deep distress. And I think the fact that human rights organizations like Amnesty, like Human Rights Watch, like the Committee for the Protection of Journalists are all speaking out, they're calling out India's outrageous behavior and its cruelty to the people of occupied Kashmir.
What can you briefly, again, you did a great job giving a 2-minute history of the, can you briefly talk about the UN's role in this? It's been very fraught. It has been in and out, and tell us what the UN's role has been and what it should be, you think, in your view.
There are 11 UN Security Council resolutions on Kashmir, and they entail an obligation on the part of the UN to help hold a plebiscite in Kashmir so that the people there can decide on how they want to be governed and how they want to live. These resolutions have not been implemented. And I think that is an obligation that the United Nations still has. As well, the Secretary General of the United Nations today talks about prevention being at the heart of what he wants to do around the world. Well, he needs to act to prevent a bigger crisis in South Asia, because what is happening in occupied Jammu and Kashmir is certainly a flashpoint. There are already tensions which are at a peak between India and Pakistan. And the situation can snowball into a much bigger crisis. So I think the UN certainly has long-standing obligations, and it also has immediate obligations, including an end to human rights violations that are going on. I mean, human rights is at the center of what the UN does. So if the UN doesn't speak out, which some UN officials have spoken out, the UN Secretary General has issued a statement expressing his concern and also saying that the matter must be resolved according to the UN Charter and according to the UN Security Council resolutions. But we need action. We don't just need words, we need action.
Well, what about the mediation by the Secretary? Now, India has traditionally not wanted the UN to mediate this. Is that correct? But have you told the Secretary General what you've just told us? Now, this situation, as you say, is even more fraught with danger than the Palestinian-Israeli situation, because only Israel has nuclear weapons, where in this case, both nations have nuclear weapons.
You know, Prime Minister Imran Khan, my Prime Minister, has repeatedly said that we mustn't let the situation spin into a bigger crisis. And you're absolutely right, this is a very fraught situation. Now, the UN Secretary General has always said he's ready for mediation, and we'd like him to offer mediation, but he's also qualified that by saying both countries have to accept mediation, Pakistan and India. And India's refusal to accept mediation. So where are we right now? India refuses to talk to Pakistan. India refuses to accept mediation, whether it is mediation offered by President Trump or it's offered by the UN Secretary General. And India refuses to abide by its human rights commitments that it upholds in various UN bodies. And of course, India, above all, refuses to implement solutions which remain on the books of the UN Security Council. So this is a litany of yes, no, 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 no to everything, except to repression, oppression, violations, and acting with impunity, which is what its occupation forces do in Kashmir.
My last question, what has the U.S. position been historically? And they've had very good relations with Pakistan, especially during the Cold War, and they've had better relations with India recently. What has been the U.S. position over time since this began at the time of partition and the end of British rule until today, the Trump administration's position?
The US continues to accept, acknowledge, and recognize that this is an international dispute and that it must be resolved peacefully, which is exactly what Pakistan says. We would like to resolve this dispute peacefully, but it has to be in accordance with the wishes of the Kashmiri people and in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions.
So you're pleased with the US position?
Well, we think the US should step up and do more. We think the US should call out on the human rights violations that are going on. I think the US should also call out and say something about its role in helping to implement Security Council resolutions. If the United States, which has been a standard bearer for human rights.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Ambassador, can you share any insight on why India made this move now, earlier in August? Is there any particular reason that you see that has led to this development?
I think that's a question that only the Indians can answer. I cannot answer. All I can say is that my country has seen and described this action as illegal, as an illegal and illegitimate annexation of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and a violation of Security Council resolutions, because Security Council resolutions clearly say that there can be no material change that can be brought about in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And this is clearly an attempt to bring about a material change.
That leads me to my next question, which is that Pakistan's ministry said in a statement that as party to this international dispute, Pakistan will exercise all possible options to counter the illegal steps made by India. And that's a quote from their statement. And I wanted to ask you what those steps might entail, if you care to comment on what options Pakistan has in response to this move by India.
I think the intent of that statement was to say that we will stand by the people of Jammu and Kashmir, that they're not alone, that we will continue to be their protector, and that we will continue to speak out for them and do whatever we can, and that all diplomatic and political options will be exercised by Pakistan, which is exactly what we're doing. We took up this issue. We asked the Security Council to convene and to discuss this issue. That happened. We are going to be speaking at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So you can see that we are going to be using every diplomatic forum. My Prime Minister will be coming here for UNGA's High-Level Week, which is the General Assembly's High-Level Week. He will be speaking on this issue. He will be meeting with other world leaders. So we are going to continue to build political and diplomatic momentum to bear on India, and India then listens to the voice of the international community.
You and Joe mentioned earlier the issue of the fact that both Pakistan and India are nuclear armed states. To what extent, what is the degree of danger of an increased risk of nuclear conflict in the wake of this development?
I can tell you, Pakistan does not wish to see any kind of conflict. And Pakistan is a responsible nuclear weapon state. That is why we are urging the international community that it must step in before there is a bigger crisis. We do not wish to see a bigger crisis. There is a crisis that is going on now in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. It is a crisis that is affecting the daily lives of men, women, and children. And before that gets out of hand, it's important that the international community acts to prevent any bigger crisis.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was my last question.
Well, we'll let you go, Ambassador. We know you have another appointment, and it really was great of you to join us for these 20 minutes. And we hope that this crisis is resolved peacefully. So thank you again for joining us. That was Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi coming to us from the Pakistani mission to the United Nations in New York City. And you're watching CN Live.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're watching CN Live on Consortium News. I'm Joe Loria.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss. Join us every Friday from 8 to 10 Eastern Time.
We're streaming through consortiumnews.com.
And on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and DLive.
CN Live.
Your weekly insight into the news.
Turn now to the crisis in British politics. It's been a dramatic few days in Westminster, to be sure. Prime Minister Boris Johnson lost a vote on Wednesday to prevent a no-deal Brexit, and he called for a second bill to have a general election on October 15th. That was voted down in the first reading. We understand there'll be another one on Monday. That October 15th election date would be just days before the British Prime Minister, whoever it is to meet with EU officials. Johnson has called, and the Daily Telegraph, I have to add, has called Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, a hypocrite for not agreeing to a general election after he's been calling for one for months. But it appears that Corbyn may have higher interests involved here in mind rather than his own political fortunes. Wanting a ban on the no deal that Boris Johnson had been threatening before a possible election might be a way to prevent rapacious U.S. interests from getting into the British market, essentially raiding Britain in some kind of Trump-Johnson sweetheart deal. So I see the United States as playing a big role here. We are joined from Edinburgh, is that correct, John?
Yes, Edinburgh, Scotland.
From Edinburgh, Scotland, by John Wight. He's a journalist, and he's a keen observer of British politics. And we welcome you to CN Live. Thank you, John, for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Joe.
So now that this bill has passed, a no-deal Brexit is not possible, where does this leave Johnson? And am I correct in my assessment that he's looking to get out without a deal with the EU so he can make one with Trump?
Absolutely correct in every particular. Johnson's been in post for 6 weeks. He has not been elected Prime Minister. He assumed office after his predecessor, Theresa May, resigned after 3 years of failed negotiations with the EU. She came up with a withdrawal bill that nobody liked across the board. Johnson assumed office promising to fulfill the will of the people, in his words, by making sure Britain comes out of the EU on the 31st of October with a deal or with no deal. But he's been entirely disingenuous the whole way through because he's never been interested in a deal. His preference is for a no deal. And he received the stamp of approval of one Donald J. Trump at the G20 in Biarritz. And Donald Trump, when Boris Johnson first put to Parliament that he was going to suspend parliamentary business for 5 weeks, this is unprecedented, and he received the permission of the Queen. Now think about how undemocratic that is. A Prime Minister who has not yet received a mandate from the British people as Prime Minister going to an unelected head of state to receive permission to suspend the elected Parliament in order to drive through a no-deal Brexit in violation of Parliament. Parliament does not want a no-deal Brexit. When people voted on the 23rd of June 2016, they did not vote per se for a no-deal Brexit. They just voted for Brexit in the majority, a 4% majority. No deal was not on the ballot paper. And why is no deal important, Joe? Because 3 million UK jobs are dependent on Britain's current relationship with the EU. Supply chains will be disrupted. The government produced its own document forecasting what the initial consequences of no deal would be, and it makes chilling reading. We're talking about the potential shortages of medicines, of food, chaos at the ports because new custom arrangements would come in place, and most particularly of all, the peace in the north of Ireland, which has held sway since the late 1990s. That would be in peril because there would be the possibility of the reimposition of a hard border between the 6 counties in the north of Ireland that are controlled by the UK and the 26-county Irish Republic, which is a EU member state, again because of a change in customs arrangements. That could be a catalyst for a return to conflict in the north of Ireland. But Boris Johnson and his gang of hard Brexiteers are not interested in that because we know that this Tory establishment and a significant section of the British security establishment has never accepted the Good Friday Agreement, which is the name given to the peace document that was introduced by then Tony Blair with the other parties involved in that conflict. They've always seen it as a surrender document. So I have no doubt that they would have no problem with the prospect of British troops reappearing on the streets of Belfast, in Derry and other parts of the north of Ireland. So Johnson is clearly trying to make this a people versus parliament dynamic, with he and his other gang of old Etonians at the head of the people, fulfilling the will of the people in their rhetoric. But as Albert Camus said, to paraphrase the French philosopher and writer, the will of the people has always been the alibi of tyrants. The man's a complete opportunist. And this, I think, Joe, has moved beyond Brexit or Remain. It's moved to the condition of whether you stand on the ground of the politics of socialism and solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn, or you stand on the ground of US vassalage and disaster capitalism with Boris Johnson and his hard Brexit Taliban.
Now, Corbyn is not doing that well in the polls. The Labour Party is around 30-something%. Would not probably win an outright majority. If there were a general election and was talking about another coalition government, I think Labour have been doing better previously. But do you think that he's putting Britain's interests above his own and wanting to stop this no Brexit deal first before he has a general election?
Absolutely.
Or am I being, yeah.
He is well aware of the impact on working class people of a no-deal Brexit, even though a lot of working class people in England, especially, and in Wales, which are the 2 constituent nations that voted for Brexit. Just so your viewers who may not be aware of the UK. UK is not a country. The UK is a state made up of 3 historically constituted nations: Scotland, Wales and England, and the colonised, in my view, 6 counties of the north of Ireland. In Scotland, 62% of people voted to remain. 55% of people in the north of Ireland voted to remain. So this Brexit vote was delivered by people in England and Wales. Jeremy Corbyn is putting the country first. We know that he is, by instinct, a Eurosceptic, but he understands that this issue is being dominated by the hard right, the most reactionary forces in Britain, and the impact to the 3 million jobs which I mentioned. But you say that Jeremy Corbyn is not doing well in the polls, and you're very correct in that. But think about this, Joe. In 2017, when Theresa May called the general election, she did so when Corbyn was over 20% below her in the polls. And because of his manifesto of reinvestment, of wealth redistribution, of ending austerity, the most savage austerity programme of any Western democracy in the world, 10 years of Tory austerity, 120,000 people have died as a direct result of austerity. People are suffering unparalleled levels of despair. It's like 19th century Victorian levels of poverty in this country. The inequality is through the roof. So Corbyn is a man who has a manifesto that would address all these things. And I think after the 2017 election, when Theresa May, who had a parliamentary majority going in, she lost that majority because Corbyn's manifesto of wealth redistribution and an end to austerity lit everything up. And he is not a great performer at the dispatch point in Parliament, but he's fantastic as a people person. When he gets around the country, people respond to him warmly, despite the demonisation that he has received in the right-wing press in this country.
So let me ask you about 2 things. You mentioned the results of the referendum in both Northern Ireland and Scotland. So in Northern Ireland, it was 55% decided to remain.
Yeah. So
what does that say about the future of North and South and the Republic of Ireland?
Here's the ironic thing.
Was there a chance of a actual unification of Ireland? Because
I think it's inevitable. I can't say when, but I think there's a shift in consciousness in Ireland because the younger generation does not come in is not coming into its maturity with the old traditions of sectarianism and bigotry and so forth that previous generations have come. But a key thing about, Bill Clinton was right in one sense when he said it's the economy stupid. Ireland, the north of Ireland has benefited enormously from EU membership because agricultural subsidies, it's a very highly agricultural economy in Ireland, and they've benefited from the subsidies that have flowed from the EU. So yes, there could be a move towards reunification, especially if the economy tanks in light of a hard Brexit, which I fully believe it would. But Scotland is another case. In 2014, we went to the polls in a referendum on Scottish independence, and I was opposed to it then. And I do regret that now, because I believed in working class unity across the country's historically constituted nations. But we were told in Scotland by the No campaign, led by David Cameron, the then Tory Prime Minister, that the condition of Scotland remaining in the EU would be to vote no and remain in the UK. And here we have, 2 years later, this referendum and Brexit. 62%, as I mentioned earlier. So that's a decisive majority. So the first thing that would happen the day after a no-deal Brexit came to pass would be the train of Scottish independence hurtling down the tracks. And the polls in favour of Scottish independence have never been higher in favour of Scottish independence. People have had enough in Scotland of being dragged of this Tory government. Tories are reviled in Scotland, but a sharp lens is now being shone on this country's passage for a constitution, because what has been exposed in these last weeks, where an unelected Prime Minister received permission from an unelected head of state, the Queen, to dissolve the elected Parliament, what has been exposed are the very weak democratic foundations of a country which, in conjunction with the US, is never done lecturing the rest of the world about democracy, and indeed on regular occasions drops bombs on countries in the name of democracy. So what this has achieved, Johnson's démarche, has been to light up the case for constitutional reform, support for Scottish independence, and an end to the UK.
When could another referendum on Scottish independence be held, do you think?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon, the head of the Scottish Nationalist Party, has said if no deal Brexit comes to pass, she'll be wanting to hold one in the summer of 2020. So very, very soon. There is real, this is a colonial relic of a state. The UK was forged in mercantilism, born in mercantilism in the interest of a rising colonial class. And it's no longer fit for purpose. It's underpinned by semi-feudal institutions, the monarchy, an unelected second chamber, the House of Lords, a Privy Council, an unelected and unaccountable judiciary. And people are starting to wake up to the reality of this, especially the younger generation. It's the young people who have been driving this no Brexit campaign. And it's very inspiring to see, Joe. Just like the young people are the life force of this Extinction Rebellion. They are really the hope for us. We fought our battles, we've lost many, but it's the young people that give me hope, because they benefit from being part of a larger polity. And at a time when the world is integrating closer more and more, China with its One Belt, One Road initiative, Russia with the Eurasian Union initiative. Here we have the two prime Western English-speaking nations, the US and the UK, going on an isolationist path, going on ever object, because the neoliberal economic model which sustains the West is in all but name is dead. And it's only being life forced by these savage austerity programs. And the only thing needs to bury the corpse. That is what's causing these crises. And this crisis is obviously hitting the EU as well, which is a neoliberal EU. But my view is this is a case where the cure is worse than the disease. And these are the forces of nativism, of xenophobia, of anti-immigration, of empire nostalgia, and a British exceptionalism that has succeeded in sowing false consciousness large swathe of a predominantly English, predominantly white, deindustrialized working class as to the reasons for their powerless condition.
You say that Britain and the US are going down the isolationist path, but they're still very deeply involved all over the world. The US has over 800 bases, and Britain pretty much attached itself to the US empire when they officially lost theirs, but their intelligence agencies are everywhere. They're involved in terrible things, and the biggest one, of course, was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. My question is, if England becomes independent, in other words, Scotland is independent, Northern Ireland joins the Republic, and England is on its own, and Wales probably would want to leave too, would that weaken Britain's current influence, mostly malign, around the world? Would that be, in a sense, a positive thing?
Absolutely positive. It would be a benefit to mankind, given Britain's malign role in the world, which predates its membership of the EU by what 4 centuries. You're absolutely right. These are imperial states. Britain is a loyal henchman of the US, imperialism. And it would be even more so after Brexit, because it would need the US for our trade deal. And we saw a glimpse of what this would entail, Joe, when British Royal Marines were used to storm the Iranian oil tanker in the Straits of Gibraltar at the behest of the Trump administration. So Britain would be wedded to US foreign policy in a way that it never has been before. And this would be a disaster, because Britain, already a piratical state, a state that whose crimes, in the words of the great Irish revolutionary James Connolly, would shame all the devils in hell, would be even more wedded to this empire emanating from Washington. When I say isolationist, I mean protectionism, I mean economically isolated, I mean trying to draw these...
Anti-immigration, that kind of thing,
But certainly, 800 bases in over 70 countries around the world. They're not there to make the world safe for democracy, as you know. They're there to make the world safe for the ability of Western, predominantly US corporations, to plunder the planet's natural and human resources. These would be the two most malign actors. But the thing that gives Britain its prestige in the world stage, it's been able to enlarge it on the world stage as a major power under the umbrella of US hegemony. But its Trident nuclear missiles gives it its permanent seat at the Security Council at the UN. But those Trident nuclear missiles are in Scotland. And a key component of Scottish independence is to scrap these Trident nuclear missiles. And without those and the prestige that comes with those, it would be very difficult to see how England, little England, could continue to keep its status as a world power. And indeed, I think it's already lost that status, Joe. I mean, this crisis has really revealed how much of a backward-looking state it is, that there's a colonial relic in every particular, and it only, as I say, has been able to pose on the world stage as a major power at the behest of the US.
That would be an interesting battle at the UN about whether England could take over a British seat with the veto.
Yes.
I mean, the Russian Federation was able to get it when the Soviet Union dissolved.
Yes.
But I wonder if England would survive or not. But you still think it would be even a truncated English army instead of a British army, but still, with its intelligence services, still in team with the US, still wreak havoc, wouldn't it?
It would still wreak havoc, because Britain is renowned for its intelligence services and also its special forces. They are renowned as being among the best in the world. So on that level, they would still pack a punch, and they would still be of use to the US and the empire in that regard.
Yeah,
it would be a huge loss of national prestige, and that's very important amongst ruling classes. It's an abstract thing. It's not tangible, but it is palpable, and it does hold sway. And Britain has a large soft power outreach as well. It's very much a cultural hegemon with the BBC World Service and obviously its newspapers and so on. So it does have some reach. It would still retain some reach, and it would still keep up a malign presence. That's unless Jeremy Corbyn is elected as Prime Minister. The reason they hate Jeremy Corbyn so much, the reason he's received such a drubbing of unprecedented levels, demonisation, real enemy of the people stuff in the right-wing Tory press, is not because of his domestic programme. They can live with that. It actually makes economic sense. Investing, reinvesting, reintroducing aggregate demand in the real economy and so on. It's on foreign policy. He supports the Palestinians. He would be against the arms trade with the Saudis, which is second only to the United States. The NATO membership would be imperiled under Corbyn. That's why they hate him, and that's why they're determined, come what may, to make sure he doesn't get into downward 10 Downing Street. And I wouldn't put anything past these people to do whatever it takes to make sure that doesn't happen.
He'd also probably let Julian Assange go, Elizabeth.
Absolutely.
Well, just as a side note for a moment, your description of why they hate Corbyn so much reminds me a lot of, some similar candidates in the United States who are hated and smeared in the press because of their anti-war stances. But you've given us a really dire image of what happens in a no-deal Brexit, and I wanted to ask you how likely that is going forward. Can you explain what you think will happen as we watch this kind of crisis unfold?
Well, the situation has moved to the point where I voted to remain in the EU, as I mentioned earlier, because I believe the cure is worse than the disease. It doesn't mean I'm a fulsome supporter of the EU. Jeremy Corbyn's official stance in that campaign as head of the Labour Party was remain and reform, try and reform the EU. The EU has much to answer for in terms of being responsible for this crisis because of its role in impoverishing Greece, its lack of democratic institutions, And obviously there's been issues around the collapse of neoliberalism and how that's put pressure on economies and on societies because of free movement of people. That is the real driver of the Brexit vote. But the no deal for me is now off the table. The issue is now whether you have a no deal Brexit or a negotiated Brexit. I'm not hard Remain. I don't think we can go back to where things were in 2016. We had a referendum. 17.4 million people did vote to Brexit. And if they were to just ignore that result, that would have ramifications for social cohesion going forward for many, many years to come. So I think it's a negotiated Brexit where you try and retain a trade relationship with the EU, but you come out in a managed way that doesn't imperil these 3 million jobs I mentioned, supply chains and peace in Ireland, which is really, really important. So that's the two poles, Corbyn standing for a negotiated Brexit or a hard Brexit, a fundamentalist Brexit. The fundamentalist Brexit has been defeated in the Parliament after Johnson tried to railroad through a hard Brexit by suspending Parliament. And so the 31st October, beyond 31st of October, when by default we would come out. So it's now about how we get a general election and get a new Prime Minister, which for me should be Jeremy Corbyn, who would have his own negotiating team to try and negotiate a negotiated Brexit with the EU, extending the deadline another 3 months.
So some news outlets
space to do that.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to ask you, some news outlets have called this current crisis unprecedented since the Second World War. You've described it in similar terms, but can you comment on that and expand on it, especially for our US audience who might not understand the real significance of this?
Well, David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister who introduced Brexit, he did so. These are old Etonians. These are products of these public schools, which in the arcane language vocabulary of England of the British state are actually private schools. These elite educational institutions like Eton and Harrow and Fettes in Edinburgh, where I am, where Tony Blair spent his formative educational years, Oxford and Cambridge Universities. These people are imbued with this born to rule entitlement. They're inculcated with this hubris, this ruling class hubris. And Cameron in his hubris, he didn't understand the country. When he introduced legislation to have this referendum in 2016, in order to clear the issue with his own backbenchers, Europe has always been a hot button issue within the Tory party, but not really beyond that in the country. He believed that Remain would win easily. But this was seen as an opportunity to give the establishment a kick in. And the Brexit vote was a scream from the bowels of austerity Britain, of people who suffered immeasurable economic harm as a result of Tory austerity. And they cast a vote. They had nothing to lose. Why do they care about free movement? They've not had the opportunity to travel to the next town, never mind to go and work in France or go and work in Germany. And I understand that. But since the collapse of neoliberalism, and with it the collapse of the centre ground in all but name, there's been a vacuum left. And that vacuum's been filled by the forces of reaction rather than the forces of the left, which I am on. We see a manifestation of that with Donald Trump. And Brexit is the British manifestation of that. The right has been winning the battle of the ideas when it comes to explaining the ravages of austerity, i.e. it's not inequality, it's not 30 years of Thatcherism, it's not the banks, it's not the greed of the rich, it's not the 1%, it's migrants, it's the foreigner, it's Brussels. And that has gained traction because Britain has never properly addressed, much less redressed, its imperial and colonial past. We have a ruling class that still believes that the empire was a good thing, that it wasn't an enterprising grand larceny, rapine, and raping other countries' economies. It was a good thing. It was spreading civilization to the world. And it's all dressed up with the pomp and ceremony that no country does better than Britain. And so the pathologies of a diseased culture came to the fore in the context of Brexit: nativism, xenophobia, British exceptionalism, and empire nostalgia. So this is why it's such a crisis, because it's a real crossroads for Britain. Is Britain going to go forward and going to address these things and these maladies of its past and move forward and understand its real place in the world, that we're not a major power and we shouldn't stop acting like one. We should act like a responsible country that advocates diplomacy and peace and stability. Britain is wedded to US foreign policy and has been for many, many years, since the end of the Second World War, and certainly since after the Suez Crisis. And its ruling class has benefited from that, but the working class has not benefited from that, much less the world. So not only poor people in this country or working class people in this country, but all over the world are crying out for a change in this paradigm whereby Britain and America storm around the world like an imperial juggernaut, smashing borders, no respecter of national sovereignty, no respecter of international law, and only sowing crises after crises.
Do you think this particular crisis is enough to wake up that elite class that you mentioned? Or do you think they're still going to just keep on keeping on?
Well, I don't think they'll be woken up until they're replaced. I don't think they'll be woken up. We need to take a bulldozer to Eton. We need to take a bulldozer to Harrow. These are hotbeds of extremism. These produce war criminal after war criminal. These are extremists in tailored suits. You know, these are our fundamentalist Islamic madrasas, these establishments, and actually they do more damage and they're even more dangerous given the crimes that have issued out of these establishments. And until we address our history and properly and truthfully, the progress will never be made. You see the same in the United States. White supremacy defines America far more than democracy ever has, and it's the same here in the UK. We saw it with Charlottesville. We saw it with the lamentation of the Confederacy, you know, and that produced Trump's election was in part, I would contend, a racist reaction to Obama. Not that I'm a fan of Obama, far from it, but this is a white supremacist state. We really have to tackle the roots of this white supremacy, and that, for me, are the ideological roots of the problems we're facing today.
And, you know, why is it, do you think, that the working classes that have been so disadvantaged by, you know, neoliberal and also, you know, conservative politics, you mentioned austerity, you know, what is the reason that those populations who are so damaged by conservative politics nonetheless go the xenophobic route rather than pointing the finger at the actual source of their economic and other pain?
It's false consciousness, and that false consciousness is sown by a media that's controlled by a clutch of billionaires who are the real problem in our society. That's why alternative media is so important. That's why there's been such an attempt to close down alternative media, close down RT, close down alternative forms of media, police Facebook, police Twitter, police social media in total. But the media has a massive role to play in this. US media's tittle-tattle, the rich, the famous, celebrities, leaving behind millions of people who have not benefited from this neoliberal bonanza. The media plays a massive role in this, and that they have to take their share of the blame. I mean, they acted so surprised when Trump was elected, really. All of us could see it was going to happen. He was going to be elected, especially after the Democratic primaries were rigged to ensure Hillary Clinton was a Democratic Party candidate. We have a similar process here where the mainstream media has been going out of its way to attack and undermine Jeremy Corbyn, the spurious accusations of anti-Semitism, that he's somehow some communist spy, that he was when Czechoslovakia was a communist country, he was a spy for the Czechoslovakians in the 1970s, that he's some kind of monster, that he talks to terrorists, that he's a terrorist enabler and sympathizer and so on. They do more damage than 1,000 bayonets. I think it was Napoleon that said that 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets, and he was right.
I think that also explains why, you know, you have these same elite interests who are so invested in shutting down independent press. You see, I just recently saw the headlines about the Pentagon wanting to act against what it says is disinformation. So do you think that that effort to push back against independent media will be successful? And what role might that play kind of going forward, do you think?
Well, it's hard to know how successful it will be. I do think that people are awake now more than they've ever been. But the problem with social media, which is a fantastic tool for us, is that while there's a lot of information on it, there is a lot of misinformation on it. It's given rise to the spreading of conspiracy theory, of regressive politics. The far right's been able to harness social media to its advantage as well. But I do think it comes down to mainstream mainstream political parties like Labour, like the Democrats, allowing space for radicals, or radicals able to open up space. You see this with the squad, the so-called squad, Ilhan Omar and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and others in the Democrats. Bernie Sanders is getting the kind of platform he's never had before. Socialism is now part of the political vocabulary in the States, where before, when I lived there, it was a profanity. The rise of Corbyn. So there is space opening up. Extinction Rebellion, more awareness about climate change and about the danger to the environment. There is more space opening up. But this year for the UK will be highly critical. What happens in these next few weeks are going to be seminal in this country's history, and by extension, in what happens in the rest of the world.
Over to you, Joe.
I don't think you're understating that John, I really don't. This really, it can't be overstated how crucial this is in the history of Great Britain. But I want to go down to the more mundane things about the deal.
Yeah.
Corbyn never really, in my view, from what I understand, never really tried to dodge the question whether he was Remain or Brexit. But now, if he were to become prime minister, let's say, and he had time till January 22nd, whatever the date would be, for another extension, could he possibly get a better deal than Theresa May get? It seems like that's the best the EU was going to give. Wouldn't he have to come back with the same kind of deal?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? He feels confident he can get a deal. John McDonnell, his very able shadow chancellor, feels confident he can get a deal. Michel Barnier, who's the chief negotiator for the EU, said they're willing to listen to Corbyn's proposals. The issue around the backstop is key. The backstop is whereby a temporary border, a non-border is maintained in the north of Ireland, which means the north of Ireland would still be under EU rules. And that's obviously not in keeping with the referendum result, and it's obviously exercising the minds of people who are pro-Brexit ideologues. So it remains to be seen. But here's what I think, Joe. If Corbyn can get a deal, if we come out under a Corbyn government, it is manifestly different. It's qualitatively different in terms of mass consciousness, because he's a socialist prime minister with a socialist programme coming out. It won't be anti-migrant. It'll be anti-corporations. It'll be anti-EU institutions. He'll maintain the rights of EU nationals who are currently living in the UK. It'll be under a much more progressive set of circumstances. I would support it in those circumstances. But a Corbyn government inside the EU would have a massive catalysing effect on progressive forces across Europe. You know, the right is on the march as it's never been since the 1930s. I mentioned Donald Trump. Marine Le Pen with her Front National in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Viktor Orban's government in Hungary, the rise of Matteo Salvini and his Eurosceptic anti-migrant. He was part of a coalition Italian government until recently with the Five Star Movement. So Euroscepticism was always a marginal political current in Europe. Now it's been elevated to mainstream. The EU at some point is going to have to wake up to what's going on around it, lapping up against its door, and it's going to have to move towards reform. The neoliberal model is dead. It has to run not in the interest of corporations and banks, but in the interest of its peoples. And unless they wake up to that fact, then they deserve to go the way of all flesh. It deserves to be consigned to the dustbin of history. The key question is, can it be reformed? You've got Yellow Jackets protesters every weekend in France protesting, being battened down by French riot police. They've been there for like 42, 43 weekends in a row. I went over to France in December and it was so inspiring. These people have commonality with people in the UK. If these struggles could be joined up across Europe, then my God, what a change that could be. That could change the whole paradigm. It could tip over the kitchen table, as it were. But Macron and Merkel, they have to understand that this neoliberal economic model is no longer fit for purpose.
You anticipate our next question about the EU and the fact that it desperately needs reforming, and this is what led to much of the reason for the Brexit vote. I recall a speech by Jacques Delors, I believe to the Trade Union Congress,
yes.
sometime in the 70s. He talked about the social market and
yes.
that the EU would be good for the workers. And I think there was a sincerity then among some European leaders then about doing that. That is long gone. So we're between leave and remain with a horrible bureaucracy that is totally beholden to the banks, central banks, and private banks.
Yes.
And leaving and creating chaos that we've seen in Britain. That speech by Delors, I want you to just talk about that and what's happened.
Let me tell you who killed the idea of a social Europe. Margaret Thatcher killed that.
Yeah.
She, in partnership with Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s, she introduced the Milton Friedmanite free market structural adjustment programs that have done so much damage around the world. And she was the one who injected the economic poison of neoliberalism into continental Europe. Continental Europe, traditionally France, Germany, had a high social wage, as Britain did in the 1970s, which means pensions, which means welfare state, unemployment. We have a national health service that was introduced at the end of the Second World War by the post-war Labour government. That would be under threat, by the way, under Brexit, at the hands of Donald Trump and the corporations that would be salivating over the prospect of breaking that up and privatising that. That cannot be allowed to happen. So Jacques Delors was sincere. You're absolutely right. But Margaret Thatcher and the onset of free market economics in the 1970s, the oil shocks in the early 70s, the liberalisation of credit and the rise of inflation, and that produced industrial action by workers whose wages were going down in value and so on and so on. That created all the industrial strife in the 1970s. But compared to now, the 1970s was a veritable utopia for workers across Europe. And so you're absolutely right. The EU has to reform. Can it be reformed back towards a social Europe? I have to hope that it can, because anything made by man and woman can be reformed by men and women, surely. And this is the argument of the pro-Brexit left, that the EU can never be reformed. Of course it can. Of course it can. It takes struggle. Socialism, which I advocate, doesn't come via a change in constitutional arrangement. It comes on the basis of mass struggle. And that's driven by consciousness, class consciousness, not national consciousness. We've lapsed into nationalism and national particularism in the wake of the neoliberal economic crisis that was unleashed in 2008. And this is a situation of striking parallels in this regard with the 1930s. And we must learn from that period, or we are headed for perdition.
You mentioned before that Corbyn's victory would have a progressive impact on the continent. And, we saw in France, they resisted what they call the Anglo-Saxon models for work. Yeah. And then we got Sarkozy and now certainly Macron, a complete tool of the banks.
Yes.
And have unbelievably instituted pretty much the neoliberal policies that were resisted for so long, not only by the French public, even by officials, elected officials, members of the parliament. But now we see, you said the yellow jackets. If Corbyn should win, that would be maybe the trigger to get the kind of pressure on the EU from the various countries to reform. And I'm glad that you think that it can be. But I want to go back to the NHS view and anticipate my other question, which I think is going to be the last one. Yes, if there is no deal and the U.S. comes in, U.S. insurance companies, and we who live here in the U.S. I'm paying over $1,000 a month, $1,169 to be exact, for insurance. This is the kind of thing that Britons would be facing. However, if there's a rump, England and Britain, and Scotland becomes independent, Northern Ireland as well, joins the Republic, what would this mean for British workers who would see right over the border in Scotland, and maybe in Wales and in Ireland, a national health service like you got now? Yeah. How would they react to that? Would they be trying to flee to Scotland?
Well, this is an argument in favour of independence, Joe, because I think it would produce a shift in consciousness. If we have a more progressive Scotland bordering a regressive England, then working class people in England could not but help be influenced by that and say, wait a minute, why have they got decent social services? Why have they not got decent healthcare? Why have they not got a decent welfare state? And that would have its own catalysing impact. I think it was Lenin that said disunity for unity amongst workers. You have to change, maybe constitutionally, the existing arrangement to produce that space for a shift in consciousness. It's all about ideology and consciousness for me. And Scotland would not be burdened by a defence budget, a defence budget that's out of keeping with its needs, its real needs. If England tried to maintain a defence budget to try and keep its prestige on the world stage as a major power, at the expense of investing in social services and schools and hospitals and so on, then there would be an influence. We saw that Cuba, when the Cuban Revolution hit, it had a massive influence on Latin America. That's why the Americans wanted to destroy it, because it wasn't anything bad it was doing, it's everything good that it was doing. And a country of 13 million, well, think about the power of Cuba, not on the basis of its military or of aircraft carriers or stealth bombers, the power of its idea. Same with the Bolivarian Revolution. They hate the idea of a socialist alternative because they are in hock to the corporations and shareholders and multinational investors. So this is where things could be exciting. I hesitate to use that word because we can't play politics. It's not a parlour game. People's jobs are at stake. People's lives are at stake. But yet the US Health Service, I've said it to friends over here and people I know, because I lived in the States for 7 years. I didn't have health insurance and I needed to get health care. And I have strong memories of standing outside a charity hospital at 7 in the morning trying to be one of the people who are fortunate enough to be selected to be given treatment on that particular day. That's what's coming down the track. on the back of a no-deal Brexit. Donald Trump is not someone that can be trusted to respect the NHS. Boris Johnson has said that the NHS is off the table in any potential trade deal with the US. How can you trust this man? He's a serial liar. He's an old Etonian. He couldn't give a damn about working people, the welfare of working people, and he certainly couldn't give a damn about the NHS. The Tories hate the NHS. The only thing that's managed to sustain it is because the people depend on it, and people in Britain revere it. But there is attempts to undermine it, to degrade it, to starve it of funds, therefore to present a fait accompli saying we're no longer able to afford it. So it's a very worrying time, but also a time of great possibility. Crisis brings opportunity, as they say. It depends on whether an organised, properly constituted left can take advantage of these opportunities. It remains to be seen whether it can.
Well, John, I want to thank you, but I have one last question, which is, if there's a Prime Minister Corbyn and he gets a deal better than May's or the same, and he would he put that to the public in another referendum saying, accept this deal or remain, and then in effect having a second referendum?
Yes, that's what he's promised to do that in his manifesto. I think he's right to do so. Nobody knew what they were voting for. There was a lot of disinformation and misinformation, propaganda. 4% is not enough of a majority on such a seismic issue to satisfy the needs of democracy. This is democracy as a zero-sum game of winner take all, and it would have ramifications, as I mentioned earlier, for social cohesion going forward. He has pledged to put Remain on the ballot, but here's my view, and this has not been prayed in aid as yet. Remain is one of the extreme positions, and so is a hard Brexit. They should both be on the ballot, but they should have a 60% threshold, so that if that's reached, then most right-thinking people can be satisfied that it is the settled will of the British people. But that's the only basis on which I think Remain could possibly gain credibility of being on the ballot, given the result of the first referendum in 2016.
Well, we were joined by John Wight from Edinburgh to talk about the extraordinary events happening in Westminster right now that really do put the future of the United Kingdom in the balance here. And thank you, John, for joining us. And please send us your articles to Consortium News. We're really looking forward to that. If you can send us your stories. Thank you again, John. All the best.
Thank you. Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Watching CN Live on Consortium News. I'm Joe Loria.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss. Join us every Friday from 8 to 10 Eastern Time.
We're streaming through consortiumnews.com.
And on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and DLive.
CN Live.
Your weekly insight into the news.
We turn now to the political crisis in Italy, where on Wednesday, the Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte named a new cabinet, which might be a short-term solution to what the New York Times called head-spinning political turmoil. This is in the vein of American coverage of Italian politics. Since I've been reading American papers, particularly the Times, about Italy, they take almost an Orientalist view towards Italy. Now, Italy is in the West. It's not an Oriental country. But it's almost Southern Europe is almost too exotic for Northern Europeans and Americans to understand, and they tend to just portray a challenge as being chaotic and can get their act together. And of course, we kept hearing about the 45th and 46th government, post-war government in Italy, and that it's always in chaos. And I always found that maybe democracy is a bit chaotic sometimes, and it's better perhaps to change governments than to stick with an oppressive one. But what we've seen now, I want to ask our guests this question, and that question is, and I'm going to introduce you, is this what we've gone through now in Italy over the last couple of years, and this particular crisis, is it demonstrably different than the crises that Italy has gone through since the end of the Second World War? And to join us to answer those questions are two Consortium News contributors. They also write for other news organizations, and they both happen to be in Milano. Attilio Moro is based in Brussels. He covers the EU, so he'll be able to give us that perspective as well. He's an Italian, and I've known Attilio many years. We were colleagues at the UN in New York, in the 1990s. And Attilio joins us from Milano. And also in Milan, where he's based, is Andrew Spannaus. Andrew is also a contributor to Consortium News. Both of them write about Italian and European politics. And I welcome both of you to CN Live. Thanks for coming on. Let me start with you, Attilio. How is this crisis that Italy has gone through now different, or is it different from previous ones? What are the different features of this one?
It's different because when last year this government has been elected, the expectation by the people, the constituency, the voters was that, I mean, we have to change everything in Italy. We have to start from scratch. Let's send home all the traditional parties. So let's try with these two new, relatively new parties. La Lega was already in the Berlusconi's government twice, even 3 times, I guess. But the movement Five Star was a completely new movement, not even a party, which for the first time got an incredible chunk of the vote during the election. It reached 33%, which is something that just only traditional mass party were able to reach during the 90s and during the beginning of the century. And then it stopped. I mean, the traditional mass party disappeared from the scene, and that was the only one, the movement Five Star, to reach this result. Enable people to hope that something really was changing in Italy. Don't forget that this new party, Movement Five Star, was an anti-establishment party. Was a party which during the election made a lot of promises. The problem with this party was that they had to get into the government with another party, La Lega, which was a completely different party, because the first one, the movement Five Star, was from the south. Main constituency was in the south, while main constituency of the Lega was in the north, with conflicting political agenda. The Lega was more attentive to the middle class, but especially to the industrial reality of the north, complaining that they paid too much taxes for the south, while the other one, the Five Star movement, was rooted in the south, wanted to beat the historical misery of the south. You know, it's a conflicting agenda, but they stick together in this new government, hoping that they could run the country for 5 years, which didn't happen, because after a little less than 1 year, they realized that they were incompatible, and it was not possible to keep on going with this day-per-day solution to huge problems of compatibility.
Thank you, Attilio. I want to bring Andrew in. Is it more than just the League, which was called the Northern League originally? It certainly is a northern movement. Is it more than just, certainly the north-south component, what Attilio talks about, is extremely important. But put this in the context of a European-wide, even including the United States, when you saw this 2016 election, emergence of popularism, mostly on the right, of course. What role did that play in the Italian crisis of the last year or so?
This crisis is a little different than most of the government crises. What comes to mind for me is 2011 and 1992, because the issue here is the European Union. The issue, and it is the opposition, what you would call populism, the opposition that comes from the League, the Lega and the Five Star movement, to the policies of the EU, the European Union, which have generally been identified as responsible for the effects of globalization. So economic effects of globalization. And this government crisis is about getting rid of, although the League sort of did it on its own partially, but getting the League out of the government so that you have a government that will come back into the European Union, that is not be directly and openly in conflict with the European Union. So you've had a revolt of voters across the West over the past few years based on many different components, but I think that the main driver, and this is what I argue for in my recent book, for example, Original Sins, about the European Union, that the driver is the effects of economic and financial globalization over the past 30 years. That this is the fertile ground in which the populists are able to exploit people's discontent, both economically and also on immigration, culturally, in these various areas. But this has allowed people from around Europe, as in the United States, the election of Donald Trump, parties mostly on the right, but not only on the right, also on the left, to come into power or to get close to power in other countries who are anti-establishment, anti-system. That's right. They say that we got to kick all the bums out. And that was what the Five-Star Movement, that was their big thing. We got to kick out all the corrupt politicians. It's allowed them in Italy to get into power, the only government in Europe that was actually made up fully of these anti-system parties. And the League, though, took a much clearer position than the Five-Star Movement did in terms of opposition to the EU, to the European Commission. I'm sure we'll get into some more of the economic aspects, but this has been a big driver in Italy. That is, can we make our own budget decisions? Right? Do we make our own decisions, or is it the European Union that tells us what to do? And the League on this was, especially after about the first year of government, the League was much clearer on this point than the Five-Star Movement was. And the League was ready to take it a step further, to try to do more than they had done, because now the polls showed that the League had grown to be the largest party by far in Italy in terms of popular support. So the change in government changes the situation completely in Italy, because you no longer will have a government that placed itself in opposition, wanting to fight with the EU. And now with the Democratic Party coming in, they're saying, we're going to patch everything up and we're going to get back in line.
So there's also another element. It seems that both the League and the Five-Star Movement, Attilio, were kind of xenophobic, right? The refugee crisis, created in large part by U.S.-led wars in the Middle East, particularly Syria and Libya, and also economic policy of the West towards Africa, which creates economic migrants. What role, Attilio, if you can hear me, did the migration issue have with the crisis in Italy over the last year, and how much aligned was the Five-Star Movement and the League on that issue?
I think the Lega was much more engaged on this issue of immigration, illegal immigration, much more than Five-Star Movements. You had, at least during the last few months, you had the impression that the Five-Star movement was just following the Lega on this issue just for the sake of, staying in the government. But they were not xenophobic as much as the Lega. The problem was that, this xenophobic attitude has been working handsomely, very well electorally. It gave to Salvini and to the Lega an unbelievable support by the public opinion, but especially the public opinion and the voters in the suburbs, where the immigrants usually arrive and where they go into a kind of competition with the poorest, lowest class of the citizens living in cities, in the poorest part of cities. Lega and Salvini understood that it was a very popular issue to get voters from this area, and it was very, very effective in capturing this kind of mood, public mood. Against Europe, as my colleague was saying, the main adversary of Salvini was not, were not Italian parties, were not domestic, was the European Union. The European Union, which has never accepted, we have to say the truth, never accepted Salvini in the government because they had a completely conflicting attitude toward immigration, toward growth, toward the public debt. Public debt is the most important issue of Italian politics. In Italy, you don't understand anything if you don't start from this fact that Italy, the Treasury, has to pay every year almost 100 billion euros just to serve the debt, public debt, which is something that no government is able to do so without the support of the European Union. If the European Union decides that you have to stick to the Maastricht Treaty, no, the government has to shut down, because I mean, so it's a kind of delicate play which is played by Italian governments, European Union, Brussels. The other issues, immigration, whatever, they are functional to this play. They are even ready. They have been able during the last year before this government to pay Italian government in order for him to accept the illegal immigration. And
so, Attilio, like in Greece, the banks, private banks, have an enormous power over the Italian situation. Isn't that right? What's going on in Italy?
Even worse, because I mean, Italy is a big country. Greece, I mean, you can help Greece, but you cannot help Italy if it declares a default.
Yeah. Andrew, do you agree with that? You jump in. Do you agree with Attilio on the debt issue?
The debt question is essential, as Attilio was saying. So you have to keep in mind that the Italian public debt, which is one of the highest in the world, it's 130% about of GDP, mostly grew up during the 1980s, and it actually mostly grew due to interest rates. Right? It doubled basically in the 1980s because the interest rates were no longer set internally, that is by the Italian Treasury and Central Bank. And the market, they had to let the market set the interest rates. And it went from 60% to over 100% in less than 10 years. And this has dominated everything in recent years because, as Attilio was saying, if you have to follow the rules, the European rules, I mean, technically they're supposed to have half this much debt, right? But the European rules say that you have to get this down. And if you're above the line, you got to get it down in 20 years. So there's periodically an attempt to pressure the Italian government to say, you have to cut basically 5% of your budget every year. This is what it would require, which would mean, no law, no more social state. It would mean nothing if you actually followed this. And the crazy thing is the Italian government, for the past 25 years, almost every year, has had a primary budget surplus, meaning that they don't run a deficit except for this debt service. And the way that the financial system is set up now is that the financial markets decide if Italy is reliable. So in 2011, from one day to the next, practically, there was a political decision that suddenly Berlusconi was a huge problem. Right? People didn't like him beforehand, they didn't like him afterwards. But at a certain point, huge pressure came onto Italy because the bond yields went, the interest rate the government had to offer on the market went way up because people said, oh no, Italy's a problem, right? And this was used to get rid of the government, to get Berlusconi out of government. And this is exactly what was used to force the government last year in October, November, when they were drawing up their new budget, to force them to stay within the rules for the most part or come to a deal. Because it means the Italian government, if these rates go up, then they have to immediately come up with tens of billions more euros, and they can't do anything. So it's a complete blackmail. And there's all sorts of problems. Italy's inefficient. It could do a lot better in a lot of areas, but it's also an industrial powerhouse. But this is the issue, that if you don't find a way, change the mechanisms that force Italy to basically bow down anytime there's speculative pressure from the markets, then there's never going to be political democracy. What you have is you have the markets decide, and they're also known as financial globalization.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, now we know that Salvini from the League said on Wednesday via Facebook, he described this new cabinet as a government born between Paris and Berlin and the fear of losing one's seat. He added that they will not be able to escape the judgment of Italians for too long. We're ready. Time is on our side. In the end, we will win. And I wanted to ask, but I want to get a response from both of you on this question that I have, and that is, does Salvini have a chance of winning when an election does finally take place? Or is this more of an empty boast? And in relation to that, how stable is this new government? Do you think it's going to last long, or is this basically, as Joe called it, a short-term solution?
if it's conceivable that Salvini wins the election, next election, whatever. Okay, yeah. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. There's a kind of, informal agreement among parties in Italy to isolate Salvini, at least as far as Salvini is there. Lega is a complicated party. You have two souls in the Lega. You have the Salvini one, the populist, or the sovereignist, anti-European Lega, the tough one, and another chunk of the party which refers to Maroni, which is much more moderate, and it could lead the party again to the government, but I doubt that Salvini will be back to the government. Also because, he is not the candidate, the ideal candidate to the leadership of the country by the European partners. Without the absent, without the support of the European partners, no one political leader in Italy can get into the government. It happened with Berlusconi, which has been fired by Merkel, let's say, in 2012, I remember well. It happens other times, and against Europe cannot govern this country. And until Salvini is there, until Salvini is on an anti-European position, he will never come back to government.
Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that to add?
Well, if there had been elections now, Salvini certainly would have won in terms of votes. And this is one of the things that actually pushed him to try now, because their internal polls went as high as 38%, which in a parliamentary democracy is very, very high. And analysis that I've seen and that we've talked about here at the Foreign Press Club in Milan showed that he could have come close by himself to getting a majority, the way Italian election law is set up, if there had been a vote today. However, there's not going to be a vote very soon because the Italian institutions and the European institutions don't want to vote, and they certainly don't want Salvini in government, as was being said. So now it's very likely this government will last for a while. And I think that Salvini made a big mistake. He was being pushed. I must say, he actually held off a long time because he seemed to realize that there wouldn't be elections. But he was being pushed by everyone in his party to cash in, is what they would say, cash in on their support. But it was, it wasn't going to happen. And it wasn't going to happen because the president of the republic here has decided that the European Union is above the Italian constitution. So anytime that there is a politician who questions something about the EU, he says, no, that's not going to happen. He decided that there would be, he vetoed an economics minister last year, a very well-respected banker, an institutional man, former government minister, because he had been critical of the euro, the single currency. So there's no political debate, according to the institutions, the permanent institutions of this country, and the president is elected every 7 years, but he's supposed to defend the Constitution. According to him, there's no debate about the European Union. That's not allowed. Politics is how you deal with the crumbs, what's left over. But you can't touch that. And that's why there's going to be, that's why Salvini now is out, and he's going to be out for a while. And by the time there are elections, it's unlikely that he'll be in the same position that he is in today.
To what extent do you think this crisis and the end of this crisis can be compared to Brexit and the current crisis going on in the UK right now?
Well, it's certainly born of something similar, and it's existential. It's existential for the country, the way it's existential for Brexit. I think that in Italy there has been things exploded. They exploded very early. The 5-star movement, in 2013 got 25% of the vote without going on TV once. Right? So Italy, it was very clear that something was brewing and something big was brewing, but it was basically ignored. And the idea is we're going to keep them out. We're going to keep these guys out of the institutions and go on basically the way we were before, although we'll change our rhetoric a little bit. And that didn't work. So things boiled over at a certain point. And, if anything, it's even more here in Italy. If you look at the numbers, than it is in the UK. Brexit won by just a small amount. In Italy, up until a couple months ago, the Five Star Movement and the League together had almost 60% of the vote. If you put together, they had 53, 54. If you put together other parties that are critical of the European Union and the economic policy, went over 60% of the vote. So you've had, that's a lot of protests in this country. Right? And that doesn't mean the Italians immediately say, we all want to leave Europe, but they want to change. They want to change. And so it's definitely an existential question. And what my fear is that you're going to have this solution, which is short-term in the sense that it'll last a while, but it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem at all, especially if this government comes back in and says, well, yeah, we're going to follow the line. We're going to, try to manage it the way they did it in the past. We're going to try to manage it, get things a little bit better. The EU will probably help us out a little bit. The EU is going to help this government out a little bit. You're not Salvini, so we're going to give you a little more leeway. But they're not going to solve the overall problem. And what does that mean? It could get worse in the future. There could be a different type of populist uprising that's even worse than Salvini. Who knows?
Attilio, do you have anything to add to that?
Italy is uncomparable with the UK because, at least for this matter, because, while UK, you can conceive UK out of the European Union, you cannot conceive Italy out of the European Union. It's inconceivable. No one, even the majority, if they reach during the election a majority of parties who don't want to get out from the European Union. They just want some adjustments to this dynamic of the public debt. They should be more lenient. They should be more comprehensive of the situation. That's the debate. It's not in or out of the European Union. It's something that in Italy, no one, if you talk to the most fervent anti-European voter, no one can believe that it's possible for Italy to get out from it. While for the UK, it's not possible, but apparently it's going to happen. We are just studying the way to get out, but it's happening. In Italy, it's inconceivable. The economy would collapse, the public debt would reach 1,000%, would be, a disaster. No one is... with some rationality, can conceive such a scenario.
Also, because the president in Italy has more power than the monarch does in Britain, even though she can veto bills, she does not have to give royal assent. That almost never happens. Although Boris Johnson might be trying to do that with this particular bill about a no-deal Brexit. But Attilio, let me ask you this about the fact now that the League is out of government. Are we going to look at a more center-left government now that the right wing that far-right party is out? And what would that be in terms of, what would that mean for policy, other policies beside the European Union, social policy, for example?
Well, it's early to say because, you don't forget that the PD, which has been in the government for 3 times during the last 20 years, was on a very defensive position. You only have to think about this fact, that the only one who have been able to put on the table the question of the most deprived people in the country has been the Five Star Movement, giving to the unemployed, giving to people that never had a salary, 700 euros a month, something which happened all over in the world, in the modern world, because if you don't have work, you have still to survive. No, and they were the only one to put on the table this question and to design a law which allowed them now to get 700 euros a month, which is not much, but better than nothing. During the tenure, when the PD was staying in the government, they never managed to conceive such a measure to help the poorest in the country. On the contrary, they designed a law to help the banks. They gave Matteo Renzi gave 20 billion euros to the banks because of the systemic danger for the Italian economy. That's the difference. You know, I mean, the left at the government will be better for the poor people, for the lower class. I'm not so sure of that.
So the Socialist Party of Craxi and that gang, they were never really completely socialist, but they did. I mean, the whole European movement after the war of communists and socialism, I mean, let's say Mitterrand in France nationalized banks, for example, that is completely gone now. Do you see, I want to ask both of you, any return in any way from a left-wing popularism that could grow up and push for that, so that we have, again, a party that wants to bring a social democracy to Italy that has nationalizations, or are we done with that? Is that absolutely impossible? I'm going to ask both Andrew and Attilio that.
Well, I think it's quite clear that in recent decades, it's been the center-left parties that have been neoliberal. I mean, there's no question that, and in Italy in particular, the parties that allowed for and sometimes enthusiastically implemented the austerity, that is, cutting people's living standards, were the left. And why did they do that? Because they technically have the support of the unions. So the right-wing parties couldn't do it. They couldn't cut the budget much because the unions would come out, 1 million, 2 million people and demonstrate. The left-wing parties could do it, and they convinced the unions to accept it. So the paradox now is that the parties, often the parties the extremist parties, even on the right, are more social than the socialist parties. So, as Attilio was saying, the 5-star movement gave, this universal income. It's limited compared to what they wanted, but it's a start in giving people money back, people who are poor. The League, the right-wing party, aimed more at a middle-class vote, but they also insisted on raising pensions again for some people, and on lowering taxes for self-employed people. Self-employed often is not the poorest people, but people who are in the middle. And so, but are we going to see that from the Democratic Party or from the socialist parties, center-left? We're not seeing it at all, because as long as they're wed to the European criteria, you just can't do that. So they'll do little stuff, and they'll talk about it, but they're, the way that they've set themselves up, it's basically impossible. Are there parties on the left that are very clear and open about this? They are, but they've got a very small percentage of the vote, at least in Italy. So you don't see that, and it's very sad in a certain way that the major left parties have abandoned and left this huge vacuum, which the right-wing parties jumped right through. They totally jumped into it around Europe, saying we're much better for the people than the left is, the big left parties. And that's exactly what's happening. And that's the thing that people say here in Europe. The workers vote more for the League now than they do for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has become a radical chic party, and everybody knows it.
But they're in the government now. Will they have any influence?
Well, they're going to definitely have influence. They took the positions that they got are the positions that have to deal with Europe, and the economics ministry too. So they're definitely going to have influence there. They're set up also to take the blame in a certain sense if that doesn't go well. They were so desperate to get in and to do this. So they certainly have a role, and they have a number of parliamentarians. It's the same as the League, basically, just a little bit more, a few more. So they're there, and they have a public role. The question is, they used to be much, much higher. And can they get back there? Well, maybe they can, but it's going to be. I think that in this climate, they're going to have a very hard time showing that they're actually going to change something. They're going to have to hope for some help from Germany and France, from Macron. But the problem is, and this is a big thing. You mentioned before, Salvini said this is a government born in Paris and Berlin. Well, it is. Italy has suffered greatly from French policy and German policy in recent years, because Italy is an industrial. It's very strong in the north industrially, and that's a competitor to Germany. Italy has lost a lot to France. A lot of their companies have been bought out. They lost, in Africa, Northern Africa, Libya. France is aiming to take away, get as much of the energy production, oil resources, a lot of them which are in Italy's hands. And Italy coming into accepting the EU rules in recent years has basically meant that Italy loses out, France and Germany get something more. So it's not very helpful that way for the Italians. And the Democratic Party is going to have to find a way to, besides a few words, which is what Renzi did when he was in power, have to find a way to change something. But I think they're going to be very, very hard pressed to do that. And they are set up for probably a fall in the midterm.
Attilio, I'm going to give you the last word. Is there any hope for the left, a real left, not this phony left that Andrew was describing in Italy?
I think it will take time. It will take time. The Partito Democratico, Democratic Party, is not the heir of the former Communist Party. It's more the heir of the former Democrazia Cristiana, the Christian Democrats. They are very similar in methods, in way of conceiving. They're very solidaristic, but don't understand anything about, the traditional leftist culture. Italian working class, which was Marx true accepted, which reached the Communist Party through Gramsci, which was the humanistic tradition, Italian tradition mixed with Marxism. This special cultural asset has been lost. Also because, there's no blue collars anymore. Just a few, maybe in some northern provinces. The social makeup of the country has changed. So this culture went lost. What is still there is the old ancient habit to run the day-per-day basis, political basis, in which the former Democrazia Cristiana specialized during 40 years. That's what is left, much more than a leftist tradition, cultural and political, real leftist tradition. I hope that, hoping something personal, I think that in the next few years, something new will come out. Because, this disappearing of the blue collars, the globalization, doesn't mean that people are better off than before. On the contrary, inequalities are deeper. Social makeup of the society is more difficult. As you have division in society which were inconceivable 20 years, 30 years, 40 years ago. People completely out of the society, and also people who don't make ends meet, because it's difficult, especially in big cities, to reach the end of the month. So from all these social problems, something new should come out. I think that is coming out. It's coming out. Don't forget that the political parties like Movimento 5 Stelle, the 5-Star Movement, 10 years ago it was not there. 15 years ago, in 10 years it reached 34%. Voters are moving. If someone is able to give a voice to this social uneasiness, I think that they will be able to reach a similar percentage of the vote.
So it's pretty extraordinary that there might be more, that socialism might be more popular in the United States when we look at the movement coalescing around Bernie Sanders than it is in Italy, where Giulio Andreotti would be in the Democratic Party, from what Attilio is saying.
Yeah.
Andreotti being, of course, the great Christian Democratic leader. Attilio, I hope that maybe if there's a change of government in the U.S. and there is somebody, a socialist like Bernie Sanders, that could have an influence even.
Our best hope in the U.S.
Your best hope, exactly. Your best hope for Italy is Bernie Sanders. I want to thank Attilio Moro and Andrew Spannaus. Both of them joined us today from Milano to talk about the complex and very interesting, always interesting, Italian political scene. Thank you very much for joining us on CN Live. Well, we're back live here at Consortium News Live with Elizabeth Voss. I wanted to thank our guest today. That would be Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi of Pakistan at the United Nations in New York. John Wight, who talked to us brilliantly from Scotland about the complexities of Brexit. And speaking of complexities, Italian politics, that was unraveled by Attilio Moro and Andrew Spannaus, both contributors to Consortium News, both who happen to be in Milan right now. And we're really grateful for everyone who gave us their time, and particularly to our audience who, for being loyal to us and watching CN Live. Elizabeth, good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Join us next week for episode 9. We have a special interview with a former head of the Russian desk at the Central Intelligence Agency to talk about another crisis, U.S.-Russian relations. For CN Live, I'm Joe Lauria. See you next week.
Get out your notebook. There's more.